Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. We're interested to know what places and times of day or night these documented stories reach. The year was 1847 when the Caldwell estate stood proudly among the sprawling cotton fields of Wilkes County, Georgia. The plantation house with its imposing white columns and wraparound porch was considered the jewel of the region, sitting atop a gentle hill overlooking nearly 800 acres of land. The Caldwell name carried weight in local society circles, not only for their considerable wealth, but for the twin daughters who had become the subject of whispered conversations throughout the county. Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell, identical in appearance down to the small birthmark above their right eyebrows, had turned 22 that spring, well past the age when most young women of their station would have been married with children of their own. What few outside the plantation knew was that behind the perfectly maintained facade of Southern gentility, a series of events had been set in motion that would eventually unravel the very fabric of the Caldwell legacy. According to county records discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1952, the twins' mother had died during their birth, leaving their father, Thomas Caldwell, to raise them alone. Thomas had never remarried, dedicating his life to his daughters and the expansion of his cotton empire. The first indication that something was amiss at the Caldwell plantation came in the form of a letter written by the family's longtime housekeeper, Margaret Sullivan, to her sister in Savannah. The letter, dated April 8, 1847, mentioned that the young misses have taken to spending unusual amounts of time in the quarters, something the master seems strangely unconcerned about. This letter would later be discovered tucked inside a family Bible preserved between its pages for over a century. The quarters Margaret referred to were the slave quarters, a collection of small wooden structures positioned approximately half a mile from the main house, just past a stand of oak trees that obscured them from view. The Caldwell plantation maintained approximately 70 enslaved individuals, a relatively modest number compared to some neighboring estates, but sufficient to work the land and maintain the household. Among these enslaved people were two men who would become central to the disturbing events that followed. According to plantation records preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives, they were listed simply as Samuel and Elijah, both noted as having been purchased in 1842 from a plantation in South Carolina that had fallen into financial distress. What made Samuel and Elijah unusual, based on accounts compiled decades later by local historian William Hartwell, was their education. Both men had been taught to read and write by their previous owners' children, a dangerous skill that they had carefully concealed upon arrival at the Caldwell plantation. This concealment eventually failed, however, when Catherine Caldwell discovered Samuel reading a discarded newspaper in the stables late one evening in the autumn of 1846. Instead of reporting this illegal activity, Catherine, according to her personal diary recovered in 1964 during the demolition of the old plantation house, began to meet Samuel in secret. The diary entries become increasingly cryptic around this time, with references to Sis and our shared understanding. Simultaneously, estate records show that Samuel was reassigned from fieldwork to the stables, a position that afforded him greater proximity to the main house. What historical records do not clarify, but what local oral tradition suggests, is that Elizabeth had similarly formed a connection with Elijah, who worked primarily in the maintenance of the plantation's extensive gardens. The symmetry of these relationships, twin sisters forming forbidden bonds with two enslaved men, creates an unsettling pattern that would later be described by one local newspaper as a peculiar mirroring of forbidden affections. The winter of 1846 to 1847 was unusually harsh in Georgia, with freezing temperatures that damaged cotton stores and created a sense of isolation as roads became difficult to traverse. It was during these cold, isolated months that the relationships apparently deepened. A letter from Thomas Caldwell to his brother in Charleston, dated January 23, 1847, mentions his concern about a strange melancholy that has overtaken Elizabeth, while Catherine seems almost feverishly animated. I fear the isolation of this winter has affected their temperaments in opposite ways. What Thomas failed to perceive was that his daughters were not suffering from winter melancholy or cabin fever, but were instead engaged in a dangerous game of secrets and forbidden relationships that violated every social code of their time and place. The consequences of discovery would be devastating not only for the enslaved men who could face torture or execution, but for the Caldwell name itself, which would be irreparably tarnished. The first concrete evidence of the true nature of these relationships emerged in a series of coded messages found pressed between the pages of a volume of poetry belonging to Elizabeth. These notes, written on scraps of paper and dated throughout February 1847, contain what appear to be arrangements for meetings and expressions of devotion. One particularly revealing note reads, "The usual place at midnight. The moon will be new offering cover. He says C and S will join." 4 hearts beating as 2. This suggestion that the twins were not only aware of each other's forbidden relationships, but were actively coordinating their clandestine meetings adds a layer of conspiracy to the unfolding narrative. Rather than acting independently, the sisters appeared to be operating in concert, their identical appearances perhaps even being used to confuse and misdirect any suspicion. The turning point came on March 15, 1847, when Thomas Caldwell announced at dinner that he had arranged marriages for both his daughters to the sons of prominent plantation owners in neighboring counties. According to the diary of Catherine, this announcement was met with outward composure, though beneath my smile my heart turned to stone. Elizabeth's reaction is not recorded, but subsequent events suggest she shared her sister's opposition to their father's plans. 3 days after this announcement, in the early hours of March 18th, something happened that would forever change the course of the Caldwell family history. The plantation's overseer, James Whittaker, was awakened by what he described in a later deposition as a commotion unlike any I had heard before. Investigating, he discovered a small fire had been set in one of the storage buildings near the slave quarters. While the fire itself was quickly contained and caused minimal damage, the ensuing confusion revealed a more significant problem. Samuel, Elijah, and the Caldwell twins were nowhere to be found. A search was immediately organized, with neighboring plantations alerted and search parties dispatched along every road and trail leading from the Caldwell property. The initial assumption recorded in Whittaker's journal was that the enslaved men had escaped and, in an act of unfathomable boldness, had abducted the Caldwell daughters. A substantial reward was offered for their capture, and the situation quickly escalated into one of the largest manhunts in county history. Thomas Caldwell, according to accounts from those present, became a man possessed, barely eating or sleeping as the search continued. What the search parties did not know, and what would not be discovered until much later, was that the fire had been deliberately set by Elizabeth as a distraction. This detail would emerge in 1868 when a former house servant named Ruth provided testimony to a northern journalist documenting stories of the antebellum South. According to Ruth, Elizabeth had confided in her hours before the fire, instructing her to remain silent about what she knew. The search continued for weeks, expanding into neighboring counties and eventually across state lines. Meanwhile, Thomas Caldwell's health rapidly deteriorated. Plantation records show that by April, he had taken to his bed, attended only by his longtime house servant and a physician from Augusta who was called to the plantation twice during this period. Then on May 2, 1847, a letter arrived at the Caldwell plantation. The contents of this letter have never been fully disclosed in any public record, but its effect was immediately apparent. Thomas Caldwell, upon reading it, suffered what his physician described as a paroxysm of rage followed by a collapse from which he did not recover. He died 3 days later, the cause listed simply as apoplexy, a common term at the time for what we now recognize as a stroke. Following Thomas's death, control of the plantation passed to his brother Edward Caldwell, who traveled from Charleston to assume management of the estate. It was during Edward's methodical review of the plantation's affairs that a startling discovery was made in Thomas's private study, a small wooden box containing what appeared to be marriage certificates. These documents, crudely drawn but bearing signatures, purported to record the marriage of Elizabeth Caldwell to Elijah and Catherine Caldwell to Samuel on the night of March 17, 1847. The certificates were accompanied by a letter apparently written by Catherine, explaining that the twins had fallen in love with the two men, and knowing their father would never approve, had devised a plan to escape together. The letter described how they had been secretly planning for months, saving small items, preparing for a journey north to states where they might live, if not openly, then at least without the immediate threat of capture and separation. Most disturbing to Edward, however, was the revelation that his nieces had not been abducted, but but had gone willingly, choosing to abandon their privileged positions, their family name, and their entire social world for what Catherine described as the only true happiness we have ever known. The letter concluded with a request that their father try to understand and forgive them, though they recognized the unlikelihood of either. Edward Caldwell, after consulting with legal advisors and family connections, made a decision that would shape how the incident would be remembered. He buried the evidence. The certificates and letter were returned to the box and sealed away. Publicly, he maintained the story that his nieces had been abducted, possibly murdered by escaped slaves. The search continued, now focused on recovering bodies rather than living persons. This official narrative persisted for nearly 2 decades until a development in 1865 changed everything. Following the Civil War and the emancipation of enslaved people throughout the South, a woman arrived at what remained of the Caldwell plantation. Now reduced to less than half its former size and struggling to adapt to the new economic reality, the woman identified herself as Margaret Johnson. But her resemblance to the long-missing Caldwell twins was unmistakable. She requested a meeting with Edward Caldwell, who still maintained the property, though with greatly reduced circumstances. According to the household staff present that day, the meeting lasted several hours with raised voices occasionally audible through the closed doors of the study. When Margaret Johnson departed, Edward Caldwell emerged visibly shaken. He spoke to no one about the meeting, but immediately began liquidating what remained of the estate. Within 6 months, the plantation was sold, and Edward returned to Charleston, where he lived in seclusion until his death in 1871. The true nature of the meeting remained unknown until 1958, when a collection of letters was donated to the Georgia Historical Society by Edward's granddaughter. Among these was a detailed account of the meeting written by Edward to his wife the day after it occurred. According to Edward's letter, Margaret Johnson was indeed Catherine Caldwell, now using the surname of her husband Samuel, who had taken the name Samuel Johnson after their escape. Catherine revealed that she, Elizabeth, Elijah, and Samuel had managed to reach Philadelphia, where they lived in a community of free blacks and abolitionists who helped them establish new identities. Elizabeth and Elijah, adopting the surname Davis, had moved further north to Boston, where Elijah found work as a carpenter. Samuel, with his knowledge of horses, eventually established a small but successful livery stable while Catherine worked as a seamstress. They had children. Catherine and Samuel had 3, Elizabeth and Elijah 2, all of whom were being raised with no knowledge of their mother's true origins. Catherine had returned south only after learning of her uncle's management of the former plantation, hoping to retrieve personal items belonging to her mother that had been left behind during their escape. More significantly, she sought to correct the historical record to make it known that she and her sister had not been victims, but had instead made a choice, a radical, dangerous choice to follow their hearts despite the overwhelming social and legal barriers. Edward, however, refused her request. In his letter, he explained that he could not bring himself to reveal the truth, writing that the shame it would bring upon our name, upon the memory of my brother, is too great to contemplate. He offered Catherine a substantial sum of money in exchange for her continued silence and her promise never to return to Georgia. Whether Catherine accepted this offer is not recorded in Edward's letter, but historical records show that Margaret Johnson purchased a ticket for Philadelphia the day after the meeting and never returned to Georgia. The Caldwell family narrative of the tragic abduction and presumed death of the twins remain the official story. In 1883, a fire destroyed much of the courthouse in Wilkes County, including many records from the antebellum period. This loss further obscured the already murky details of the Caldwell case. By the turn of the century, the story had transformed into a local legend with various embellishments and supernatural elements added to what had been at its core a very human story of forbidden love and desperate choices. It wasn't until 1964, during the previously mentioned demolition of the original Caldwell plantation house, that Catherine's diary was discovered in a small compartment built into the wall of what had been her bedroom. This diary, covering the period from January 1846 to March 1847, provided the first contemporaneous account of the events from one of the participants. The diary revealed a complex picture of the relationships between the twins and the enslaved men. Catherine wrote of her initial shock at discovering Samuel's literacy, followed by curiosity, then genuine intellectual connection, and eventually love. She described conversations about philosophy, religion, and freedom that transformed her understanding of the world and her place in it. Particularly poignant were her descriptions of the moral crisis she experienced as she came to recognize the fundamental humanity of a man whom society had taught her to view as property. "I have been blind," she wrote on November 12, 1846, "not only to the suffering around me but to the very nature of what it means to be human. S has opened my eyes and now I cannot close them again, though the light sometimes pains me." The diary also confirmed the twins' mutual awareness and support of each other's relationships. Catherine described late-night conversations with Elizabeth, their shared fears and hopes, and their gradually evolving plan to escape. The final entry, dated March 16, 1847, reads simply, "Tomorrow we leave everything we have known for an uncertain future. We may find freedom or death, but either is preferable to living a lie." The discovery of the diary prompted renewed interest in the case among historians specializing in the antebellum South. Research conducted throughout the 1960s uncovered additional pieces of the puzzle, including shipping records showing passage booked for 4 individuals from Savannah to Philadelphia in late March 1847 under the names Johnson and Davis. Census records from Philadelphia in 1850 confirmed the presence of Samuel and Catherine Johnson, listed as mulatto, living in a predominantly black neighborhood with 2 children. Similarly, Boston records showed an Elijah and Elizabeth Davis with 1 child, also identified as mulatto. Perhaps the most remarkable discovery came in 1968 when a descendant of Elizabeth and Elijah Davis contacted researchers after learning of the renewed interest in the case. This descendant, a professor at a New England university, possessed a collection of letters exchanged between the twins throughout the 1850s and 60s. These letters painted a picture of 2 women who, despite the enormous sacrifices they had made, found fulfillment in their chosen lives. They wrote of their children, their work, their continuing education, and their involvement in abolitionist causes. They also expressed ongoing concern about discovery, particularly after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which increased the danger for everyone involved. The most revealing letter, dated July 4, 1865, shortly after the end of the Civil War, captured Catherine's reflection on their journey. "Today marks not only the independence of this nation, but at long last our own true freedom. For 18 years we have lived in shadows, always looking over our shoulders. Now, though many challenges remain, we may finally step into the light. Yet I find myself thinking of Father, wondering if in some way he might finally understand the choice we made. I like to believe that, freed from the constraints of the world that shaped him, he might." By 1969, enough evidence had been gathered to substantially revise the historical understanding of what had come to be known as the Caldwell twins incident. What had long been characterized as an abduction and presumed murder was revealed to be something far more complex, a deliberate rejection of the social order by 2 young women who chose love and moral principle over family privilege and safety. The descendants of the Caldwell twins, now scattered across the northern United States, have generally chosen to maintain their privacy, with only a few agreeing to limited interviews with historians. These interviews, conducted primarily in the 1970s, revealed families who had grown up with carefully edited versions of their ancestry, typically told that their great-grandmothers were Northern women who had married men of mixed-race heritage. The full truth that these women were the daughters of a Georgia plantation owner who had fallen in love with enslaved men on their father's plantation, staged their own abduction, and fled north to build new lives, was often not revealed until adulthood, if at all. Some descendants expressed pride in their ancestors' courage, while others struggled with the complex moral implications of a family history intertwined with both slave ownership and resistance to slavery. The former Caldwell plantation has since been subdivided and developed, with little remaining to mark the location of the events described. A small historical marker erected in 1972 at the intersection nearest to where the main house once stood makes only a brief reference to the historically significant Caldwell family plantation, with no mention of the twins or their extraordinary story. Local attitudes toward the story have evolved over time, from initial shock and denial to a more nuanced recognition of its significance as a rare documented case of white Southern women actively rejecting and escaping the slave society in which they were raised. Academic interest in the case has grown, particularly among scholars studying resistance to slavery and interracial relationships in the antebellum period. What remains most compelling about the Caldwell twins' story is how it challenges simplified narratives about the antebellum South. It reveals the potential for individual moral awakening even among those who benefited most from the existing social order. It demonstrates how personal connections could sometimes transcend the rigid boundaries of race and status, even as it reminds us how exceptional and dangerous such transgressions were. In Catherine's diary, she wrote, "We did not choose to be born into this world of masters and slaves, but we can choose whether to accept it." In making their choice, the Caldwell twins left behind a legacy that continues to resonate, a testament to the possibility that even in the darkest corners of human history, individuals might find the courage to follow their conscience, whatever the cost. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the story is the silence that followed, how effectively the truth was buried, how completely the narrative was controlled by those who remained behind. It serves as a reminder of how many similar stories may have been lost to history, leaving us to wonder how many other acts of resistance, large and small, have gone unrecorded and unremembered. In the end, what we know of Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell, of Samuel and Elijah, comes to us only in fragments, diary pages, letters, official records that tell us when they were born but not how they lived, census entries that confirm their existence but tell us nothing of their dreams. We are left to imagine the courage it took to step into the night, leaving behind everything familiar for the promise of something true. The plantation house where they grew up is gone now. The fields where Samuel and Elijah labored have been transformed by time and development. All that remains is the story itself, preserved not in monuments or markers, but in archives and family memories. A whisper from the past that continues to ask uncomfortable questions of the present. As for the wooden box containing those crude marriage certificates, the physical evidence of that forbidden pact made on a March night in 1847, its whereabouts remain unknown. Some historians believe Edward Caldwell destroyed it before his death, unable to reconcile himself to its implications. Others suggest it may still exist, hidden away in some forgotten collection, waiting to be discovered once again, much like the truth it contains. The search for that truth continues, not just for historians, but for all who seek to understand the complexities of our shared past. In that search, the story of the Caldwell twins stands as a reminder that history is not just a record of laws and wars and great men's deeds, but also of individual hearts and minds, of small acts of courage that sometimes change everything. In 1966, a remarkable document surfaced during an estate sale in Philadelphia. A small leather-bound journal, water-damaged but largely legible, was discovered inside a false bottom drawer of an antique writing desk. The journal belonged to Samuel Johnson, formerly Samuel of the Caldwell plantation, and contained entries spanning from 1848 to 1859. This discovery provided the first written account from one of the enslaved men involved in the escape. Samuel's journal revealed details previously unknown about the escape plan and its execution. He wrote of the meticulous preparation, how over months they had gathered supplies, studied maps, and memorized the routes of the Underground Railroad. Most strikingly, he described their journey north, a harrowing 6-week ordeal of traveling by night, hiding during daylight hours, and relying on a network of sympathetic individuals who risked their own safety to assist them. One entry, dated April 2, 1847, described a particularly tense moment. "Today we nearly encountered disaster. A patrol stopped the wagon transporting us, hidden beneath sacks of grain." Elizabeth, despite her terror, spoke with such conviction to the patrolman, claiming to be traveling to visit relatives in the next county. Her voice never wavered, though I could feel Catherine trembling beside me in our hiding place. When the patrol finally moved on, we dared not breathe for what seemed like hours. Samuel's journal also offered insights into the complex emotions he experienced during and after the escape. He wrote of guilt over leaving behind family members still enslaved on the Caldwell plantation, of the disorientation of newfound freedom, and of the constant vigilance required to maintain their precarious safety in Philadelphia. Particularly poignant were his reflections on his relationship with Catherine. In one entry from 1852, he wrote, "She sometimes speaks of what she gave up to be with me. I remind her that I know precisely what she sacrificed, perhaps better than she does herself. There are days when I see her watching women in fine dresses from our window, and I wonder if she regrets her choice. Then she turns to me, and I see in her eyes the same resolve that led her to choose this life, this freedom, this love, imperfect as it may be." The journal also revealed that communication between the twins and their former home was not entirely severed after their departure. Samuel described Catherine's correspondence with Margaret Sullivan, the former housekeeper who had noted the twins' unusual behavior in her letter to her sister. Margaret, who had moved to Richmond following Thomas Caldwell's death, apparently served as a discreet source of information about events in Georgia and the aftermath of the twins' disappearance. Through these letters, Catherine learned of her father's death and her uncle's assumption of control over the plantation. It was this information that eventually prompted her fateful return visit to Georgia in 1865, a decision that Samuel described as foolhardy but necessary for her peace of mind. His entry following her return from this journey suggests the meeting with Edward Caldwell did not provide the closure Catherine had sought. She returned more troubled than when she left, carrying the weight of her father's final days. The knowledge that he died believing she had been taken against her will, perhaps murdered, haunts her in a way I cannot soothe. In 1967, another significant piece of the puzzle emerged when researchers located church records from a small African Methodist Episcopal congregation in Philadelphia. These records documented the baptism of the Johnson and Davis children with godparents listed for each. Remarkably, Elizabeth served as godmother to Catherine's firstborn son, while Catherine was godmother to Elizabeth's daughter, suggesting the sisters maintained their close bond despite the challenges of their new lives. These records also revealed that both families moved several times within Philadelphia and Boston, likely in response to growing concerns about the Fugitive Slave Act and the increased risk of capture. The frequency of these relocations, approximately every 2 years, speaks to the persistent anxiety that must have characterized their lives during this period. By 1855, according to city directories and tax records, Samuel Johnson had established a modest but successful livery business in a predominantly immigrant neighborhood of Philadelphia. This business provided sufficient income for the family to purchase a small home, an extraordinary achievement given the circumstances of their arrival in the city just 8 years earlier. Elijah and Elizabeth, meanwhile, had moved from Boston to a small farming community in western Massachusetts by 1854. Local records indicate Elijah worked as a carpenter and cabinet maker, while Elizabeth supplemented their income by teaching reading and basic arithmetic to local children. Their relative isolation in this rural setting may have offered an additional layer of security, removing them somewhat from the scrutiny they might have faced in a larger city. One of the most intriguing discoveries came in 1968 when a researcher examining records of abolitionist organizations identified Catherine Johnson and Elizabeth Davis as contributors to several anti-slavery publications. Writing under pseudonyms, the sisters produced a series of anonymous letters describing the moral corruption of the slave system from the perspective of those who had been raised within it. These letters, published in the Liberator and other abolitionist newspapers between 1852 and 1858, never revealed the authors' true identities or specific circumstances, but spoke powerfully to the psychological damage inflicted by slave ownership, not only on the enslaved, but on the enslavers themselves. In one such letter believed to be written by Elizabeth, the author described slavery as a poison that corrupts the soul of the master as surely as it breaks the body of the slave, a system that renders true human connection impossible across its artificially maintained boundaries. The Civil War brought new challenges and opportunities for both families. Samuel's journal entries from 1861 through 1865 express both hope and fear about the conflict's potential outcomes. He wrote of sending financial contributions to support Union efforts, of attending meetings where news from the battlefront was shared, and of the community's collective anxiety about what a Confederate victory might mean for free blacks in the North. A particularly moving entry from January 1863, following the Emancipation Proclamation, reads, "Today marks the beginning of what we have dreamed of for so long." Though the proclamation's practical effects may be limited, its moral significance cannot be overstated. For the first time, this nation has officially declared what we have always known to be true, that no man has the right to own another. And I celebrated quietly, unable to fully express in words what this day means to us who have lived both sides of this terrible divide. The post-war period brought relative security as the legal abolition of slavery removed the most immediate threat facing the families. However, census records and other documents from this period suggest they continued to live somewhat guarded lives, never fully revealing their backgrounds, even as the immediate danger of re-enslavement receded. In 1873, tragedy struck the Johnson family when Samuel died unexpectedly of pneumonia at approximately 50 years of age. His death certificate located in Philadelphia city records lists his occupation as business owner and his race as colored with no indication of his extraordinary life journey. Catherine never remarried. City directories show she continued to operate the livery business with the help of her eldest son until 1881 when she sold the business and moved to the home of her daughter in upstate New York. She died there in 1890 at approximately 65 years of age. Elizabeth outlived her sister by nearly a decade, passing away in 1900 at her farm in Massachusetts, surrounded by children and grandchildren. According to family letters shared by descendants in her final years, she occasionally shared stories of her youth in Georgia, though always carefully edited to omit the more dangerous aspects of her escape and new identity. One of the most remarkable documents to emerge from this research was a letter Elizabeth wrote to her granddaughter on the occasion of the young woman's 18th birthday in 1895. In this letter, preserved by family members and eventually donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society, Elizabeth offered life advice drawn from her extraordinary experiences, though still without revealing their full extent. My dearest girl, as you stand at the threshold of womanhood, I wish to impart to you the most valuable lesson my long life has taught me. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to act in spite of it. There will come moments in your life when you must choose between what is expected and what is right, between the comfortable path and the true one. In those moments, remember that the most difficult choice often leads to the greatest freedom. I have known both captivity and liberty in this life, though perhaps not in the ways you might imagine, and I can tell you without hesitation that no comfort or luxury is worth the price of a compromised soul. The historical record remains frustratingly incomplete regarding many aspects of the Caldwell twins' story. No photographs of the sisters have ever been located, though a daguerreotype believed to show Samuel and Catherine's oldest son, taken in Philadelphia around 1870, resides in the collection of the Georgia Historical Society. The young man bears a striking resemblance to descriptions of Thomas Caldwell from contemporary accounts, a genetic echo of the complex family history. In 1969, an archaeological excavation at the former site of the Caldwell plantation uncovered the foundations of the slave quarters and recovered several artifacts, including a small carved wooden bird that, according to Catherine's diary, was a gift from Samuel. This tangible connection to their relationship now sits in a museum collection, a silent witness to a love that defied the boundaries of its time. The story of the Caldwell twins has inspired numerous academic papers, several historical novels, and at least one stage play. Yet it remains relatively unknown outside academic circles, perhaps because it complicates comfortable narratives about the antebellum South, challenging both Southern mythologies of benevolent plantation life and Northern assumptions about clear moral boundaries between the regions. What makes the Caldwell case unique is not that it represents an example of interracial relationships in the antebellum South. Such relationships were far more common than officially acknowledged, though usually involving white men and enslaved women, often in contexts of exploitation rather than mutual choice. Rather, its significance lies in the documentation of white Southern women who not only formed romantic attachments to enslaved men, but acted on those feelings in the most radical way possible by rejecting their privileged positions and fleeing with their chosen partners. In 1968, during an interview conducted as part of an oral history project, a great-granddaughter of Elizabeth and Elijah Davis reflected on her family's legacy. When I think about what they risked, not just their comfort or status, but potentially their lives for love and for what they believed was right, it humbles me. They had the courage to look at the world they were born into and say, "No, this is wrong and I will not be part of it." Even when that decision cost them nearly everything. That's a kind of moral courage that's rare in any era. The Caldwell twins' story exists now in that liminal space between documented history and legend. The core facts that Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell disappeared from their father's plantation in March 1847, along with two enslaved men that they resurfaced in the North with new identities and families that Catherine briefly returned to Georgia after the Civil War, are supported by substantial documentary evidence. Yet many details remain elusive, existing only in fragments of diaries, in letters with missing pages, in fading memories passed down through generations. Like so many stories of resistance to slavery, particularly those involving women, the full truth has been obscured by time, by deliberate concealment, and by a historical record that often failed to preserve the experiences of those who defied convention. In 2002, a final significant discovery added another layer to the story. During the renovation of a former boarding house in Philadelphia that had once housed numerous Underground Railroad fugitives, workers discovered a small cavity in a chimney containing a cloth pouch. Inside was a gold locket containing miniature portraits believed to be of the Caldwell twins as young women, along with a folded paper bearing the words Elizabeth and Catherine, Georgia, 1844. Experts who examined the locket believe it may have been deliberately hidden by Catherine before her return journey to Georgia in 1865, perhaps as insurance against the possibility that she might not return. If this interpretation is correct, the locket represents a poignant acknowledgement of the dangers she still faced even after the legal end of slavery in confronting her past. The portraits show two young women identical in their heart-shaped faces and serious expressions, dressed in the fashion of privileged Southern belles of the 1840s. Nothing in these conventional images hints at the extraordinary choices these women would make just 3 years later. Choices that would lead them to abandon the world these portraits represent and embrace lives they could scarcely have imagined at the time they were painted. Today, the descendants of the Caldwell twins of Samuel and Elijah live throughout the United States, many unaware of their connection to this remarkable story. Those who do know their family history often speak of the complex legacy it represents, of the moral courage shown by their ancestors, but also of the complicated reality that the Caldwell twins were both beneficiaries of and rebels against a system of profound injustice. The former Caldwell plantation land has been transformed by time and development, with suburban homes now standing where cotton once grew. The small historical marker, weathered by decades of sun and rain, offers no hint of the human drama that unfolded there. Visitors to the area would never know that this unremarkable intersection was once the setting for an extraordinary act of defiance against the most fundamental social institution of its time. Perhaps that invisibility is fitting. The story of the Caldwell twins is at its heart about the invisible threads that connect human beings across artificially imposed boundaries, about the quiet rebellions that often go unrecorded, about the courage to imagine a different kind of life than the one society has prescribed. In her final diary entry before her escape, Catherine Caldwell wrote, "Tomorrow we step into darkness, not knowing if we will find light on the other side." But even the darkness of uncertainty is preferable to the false brightness of a life built on others' suffering. Whatever comes, we have chosen our path freely, perhaps the first truly free choice of our lives. That choice made on a March night in 1847 by two privileged young women and two enslaved men continues to echo through time. A testament to the power of individual conscience in the face of overwhelming social pressure and to the human capacity for moral awakening even in the most unlikely circumstances. The sound of that echo grows fainter with each passing year, as those who remember the story firsthand pass away, as documents yellow and crumble, as the physical traces of the Caldwell plantation dissolve into the Georgia soil. Yet it persists, a whisper from the past that still has the power to disturb and inspire, challenging us to examine our own lives, our own moral compromises, our own courage, or lack thereof in the face of injustice. In that sense, perhaps the story of the Caldwell twins is not really about the past at all, but about the present and the future, about the choices we make, the boundaries we accept or reject, and the kind of world we choose to build or maintain. Their legacy lives not in monuments or markers, but in the ongoing human struggle to recognize and honor the humanity in ourselves and others, whatever the cost. And so the story ends where it began, with four young people stepping into the darkness of a Georgia night, leaving behind everything familiar for the uncertain promise of freedom. We know now that they found their way to that freedom, imperfect though it was. What we can never fully know is the courage it took to take that first step, to turn their backs on the only world they had ever known, to choose an uncertain future over a compromised present. In that moment of choice lies the heart of their story, a moment that continues to resonate across time, inviting us to consider what we might be willing to risk for love, for justice, for the chance to live according to our deepest values rather than the expectations of others. It is a question without a simple answer, but one worth asking again and again as we make our own ways through the darkness, seeking light.